Hello, hello. Looks like we're having people kind of file in. Welcome to today's session for ARP 2021. I'm Joanne Chung, and I'm one of the conference chairs. I want to give you a warm welcome to today's session. And I just wanted to say we had a wonderful first day, and we're happy to come back together for more great programming today. To kick it off, we'll be discussing the symposium entitled The Big Five Across Cultures. This is chaired by Amber Gail Thalmayer. Just a note before we start, if you attended last week, we had videos off, but you're very, very welcome to turn your video on if you feel comfortable. We'll see how the bandwidth goes. We have so many people joining us today, which is super awesome, but maybe this will help us get the conversation going. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Amber Gail Thalmayer.
Hello. Well, thank you all. Thank you to everyone for coming. And thank you so much to the ARP program committee, and especially Joanne and Aranda for this invitation to create this symposium. This was a really fun experience, and really appreciate getting to talk about these topics that we're excited about. And for today, for this discussion session, I think this will be a little different than last week. So last week there was a larger group of presenters, and Laura King had just such great questions for all of them that was the discussion, and it was great. But this week, we really want to get all of you talking and hear what thoughts you have. So I really want to welcome people to turn on your cameras if you're willing, and to make comments, share what thoughts you had after seeing the talks, any questions for us, but also just any feedback, any comments, what you're thinking about. We prepared a few discussion questions that went out in an email, so some questions that I will ask you, but I want to first just open the floor for any comments, any questions of our speakers, and for anyone who feels shy, you are welcome to use the chat. Otherwise, you can start speaking, you can raise your hand. And if everyone is really shy, then I will go ahead and start by asking you the questions I have for you in case you had a chance to think about those. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and do that. So one of the things that we sent out in the email, question that I have for all of you personality psychologists is, our topic, what our talks were about had to do with personality trait structure and how that works, what's universal about that, how that works across cultural contexts. But trait structure, of course, is just one of the important questions that personality psychologists tackle. And I know a lot of you work on other things. And so one question I want to just put out to all of you is, what else do you think is really important that we get cross-cultural evidence on? What would you like to see happen in research in Africa and China, in the Middle East, other places like that?
I suppose I could lead off, maybe spark some of the conversation. One thing that I've been thinking a lot about, one of my least favorite correlations of all time, is how in a lot of weird cultures, especially in America, people seem to be rewarded financially for being less agreeable. I don't like that at all. And so I'm wondering if there are other cultures where maybe the reward system ties a little bit more to high agreeableness, where people who are more agreeable tend to make more money or to have more occupational prestige. I think it would be cool maybe to look at somehow with archival data on some of the old communist bloc states, the associations between personality traits and occupational success around there, because with differences in culture, I think there might be huge differences in the personality, income, personality, like occupation type of correlations. That could be pretty cool.
Yeah, great example. I think for extroversion also, I think in North America, there's a lot of rewards for being extroverted, and in a lot of other cultural settings, I think, especially for women, there's a lot of disincentives to be extroverted, a lot of sort of punishments in place if you're too extroverted. Anyone else? What cross-cultural personality research would you like to see?
I mean, Amber, maybe I can contribute from the South African setting. So, I mean, we've done a lot of work on specifically the Big Five in South Africa. A lot of it has been focused with the NEO, but with us developing the South African personality inventory, we found that there were traits not necessarily expressed in the NEO that were coming out, similar to what Waikao would have found in China with the CPAI2 and interpersonal relatedness. And I think what we would like to see happening is that the instruments that we've created in South Africa and China, like the CPAI and like the CEPI, that those actually get used in other contexts, like maybe the US and other places in Europe, so that we can see to what extent constructs that are currently perceived as indigenous and not necessarily represented in the Big Five would replicate in those cultures. I mean, my guess is that nobody's really looked for them on that site. So, you know, we wouldn't know if they have some form of universality or not. And I think one of the things I mentioned in my presentation was that could there be a more collectivist expression of extroversion, for instance, because you picked up on that construct. We know it's something that hasn't replicated well in Africa, but it's not that it doesn't exist in Africa, it just manifests differently. So, you know, when we, even with agreeableness, the thing that Ted spoke about, we found very distinct differences with the SEPI on agreeableness in South Africa, where there was a more collectivist social relatedness type of expression of that. But we wouldn't know to what extent it replicates in European and American cultures. So I would be very interested in seeing if that happens or not.
Agreed, yeah. That's super interesting, and to think about that we could get constructs from China or from South Africa, and we might end up finding them really useful, and they might end up predicting things. And so agreed, it's a great idea. Michael, did you have an idea to share?
Thanks. Thanks, first of all, for the really great talks. It was really nice to watch them. I learned a lot. I'm not doing a lot of personality stuff myself, but I had the privilege of having a couple of people around me who, over whose shoulder I basically could look a little bit, which was really nice. And one thing that really stood out for me is the concept of tradedness. And it's also mentioned occasionally in the talks, I think. And I'm not sure how provocative this thought is in general, but I mean, how traded is personality? And in some of the SAPI data, we also see that people do not tend to describe themselves in very traded terms. It's more relational, more situationally specific, and it's not abstract. It's not what is so weird or Western about our very introspection-focused way of looking at dispositions, enduring qualities that exist out of context. And I'm wondering what is happening there. So I'm trying to ask a question that I really don't know the answer to. Maybe there is an answer that I'm just not aware of, and I'm happily informed then after that. But I'm curious what you are thinking about this, and yeah, looking forward to your thoughts.
Yeah, do you mean just ways of looking at personality that aren't traits?
So in a way, I think it's a little bit about how we can bridge the notion that we have about personality as an enduring dispositional concept. Of course, the view has changed here, and it's much more malleable and changes over our lifespan as well. But I mean, also, are we looking at the same thing when we're looking at how people describe themselves, or already find the task difficult to describe themselves out of context? I'm a little bit reminded here about the literature on self-control description. So the 20 statement test, for example, when when you differentiate between private, public, and relational aspects, and you have the stem of I am, right? So some people just find that really easy, and it's mostly the Western people. Then you find differences in how people describe themselves. But actually, when you ask people with a more situational cue, so when I'm at school, I am, then you get fairly similar dispositional qualities. And this is a very open-ended question for me. I don't know where this is headed, but I'm wondering whether the way that we ask already sets that up to find certain things. And I mean, a general yes, probably from most people on this, but I'm not sure how we can better understand the tradedness of the constructs that we're looking at.
Yeah, really interesting question. And there's a few people raising their hands. They might have good answers to that too. The one thing I want to say is you're making me think about a really interesting study. I think it's by Sue, that was about personality consistency and how there's benefits for that. Like in North America, sticking with the same personality, people will say things like, oh, I can't be myself at work. Because there's this really high value on behaving the same way across contexts. And I think it was in a Korean sample that they found that people viewed that as very immature if you thought you were going to behave the same at work and at school and with your parents and with your friends, that was a sign of poor social skills. And so it was a very opposite impression and an opposite relation with well-being. It was super interesting. Bill Ravel, do you have a comment for us?
I have a comment and a couple of questions. First of all, I love the symposium. All of you just gave brilliant talks, and it was really fascinating. Inspired by Rich Lucas right in front of me, have people looked at happiness and well-being across countries? And I think the answer is yes, but that's something we should focus on also. The emotional aspects of personality, well-being and negative well-being, are important, and how do they vary across countries? And then in response to Ted's question, so I include intellectual cognitive ability as part of personality, and that really predicts a lot of income in Western societies. I suspect it does around the world. Do we have any data? And I think that's probably, if you want to look at the big predictor of economic outcome, it's cognitive ability, at least in the Western world, and I think in other parts of the world. I mean, I know my experience in Sarawak, Pandai, being smart, was an important aspect of how you did. And so we ought to include that also. But I just really liked all the talks.
Thank you so much. It's really nice to hear. And will you just say, you mentioned well-being, and actually I want to just ask you a little more what you mean by that. I was really glad to hear you say that, because I'm working with a student right now on a paper. We've been looking at the satisfaction with life scale in Namibia and in different groups of Namibia. So I'm glad you think that's important, but will you say more specifically what you would like to see cross-culturally there?
I would ask Rich. I mean, my solution to this is ask somebody else.
Okay, great. Thank you for your comments. Allison Light.
Hi, I just wanted to respond to Michael's question about tradedness. So I study the self-concept, so mostly from a social psych perspective, so I'm an interloper here. But there's a lot of research connecting self-concept clarity to well-being in independent contexts and suggesting that there is less of a link to it in interdependent contexts. I don't think that there has been research specifically connecting tradedness to self-concept clarity, but at its core, I think self-concept clarity is about the extent to which people feel that they can easily do that 20 statements test. I often use that as an analogy when I talk about it, when I teach about it. So a little bit of research, lots of different authors. My first one that I think of is Serena Chen, another one is Helen Boucher. Again, have looked at self-concept clarity and related variables about consistency and how interdependence ends up being an important moderator of outcomes. For the work that I do, one of the things that I think is really interesting on this is understanding what is it about the cultural context that makes self-concept clarity or tradedness important in independent cultures compared to interdependent cultures. And so at one level, we could say, well, it's just that it's valued in independent cultures and it's not in interdependent cultures. but why specifically is it valued in one place or another? Is that arbitrary, or is there something about the social structure that means that it's beneficial and therefore valued?
Yeah, super interesting question. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah. Olivia, do you have comments?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you so much for all of the wonderful talks. They were very thought-provoking and really interesting. I guess I just have one question. So first I'll say that I think that all topics we're studying in personality psychology should be more rigorously done across cultures, just to like, not that that's like a very specific suggestion in response to your question, but that I think we need to do better in all domains of study in personality psychology. One thing I noticed across all of the talks was that there was kind of like this tension between kind of how we should get started studying these things across cultures. And so, you know, like I really liked that term, the I can't even say it, globalization, and kind of like taking this local versus global kind of two-pronged approach. And so I was kind of wondering from all of the panelists, you know, if we're interested in getting started and, you know, doing research across cultures and in personality psychology, like where should we start? It seems like maybe we can stop applying, you know, the big five to other cultures because that's been done a lot. But beyond that, like where do we start and how do we like forge those collaborations?
It's a great question. Before I want to turn it over to Thalmayer and see what you have to say. And I think the first thing I do want to say though is unfortunately, Wei Xiao Fan was trying to be here. Where can we start? Making technology work between the West and China is this a challenge. We've had just being able to upload his talk and I think him not actually even being able to log into this meeting. So anyway, there's just a very practical logistical challenge. But scientifically, other ways to start. Thalmayer, do you have any thoughts for that?
I think a good way to start, and this links to one of the other questions I think you were planning to pose to panelists later is, you know, what can organizations like the ARP add? What value add can you bring? And I think this is where the value add comes in, because it's as you saw, I mean, with Wei Xiao trying to get in, it's not easy for us. I mean, you can see my videos also off. We have horrid bandwidth problems here in South Africa, even though we're one of the most developed places in Africa. So trying to make links and collaborate with people is quite difficult. And if, you know, you are asking ARP, you know, you've now got the members, and how do you facilitate this? If we can make connections and collaborations on studies that are underway, that want to do cross-cultural work, and not traditionally what's been happening, though it's almost like a one-way flow, where you have a group of researchers in the US who want to come in, collect data on Africa and kind of leave, and there isn't much value add there for the researchers in Africa or for the population or whatever. A serious collaboration that works both ways, facilitated maybe by organizations like the ARP, not necessarily only the ARP. You know, that can work in terms of just getting started with the research that's out there. It will also mean exposure for people in the global north to see what's being done in the global south. I mean, it's also difficult for people in South America, for instance, to connect up, but the global south has formed quite a strong network. And you know, if we link up with like-minded people interested in doing things, whether it's the big five, whether it's with well-being, I think it will be to the benefit. And I think this concept of localization is quite interesting, and it will be fascinating to see what can come out from such collaborations.
Yeah, and one other answer, I think, sort of building on that I would like to add of where to start is, and I think this also relates to some things that Joanne has talked about you know, community-inspired research. And I think where to start, when I started doing this work in Namibia that I was describing in my talk, I started that project with a very concrete and specific question from the literature and personality psychology. And then once I was on the ground in Namibia and involving all these, people there in the project, there were just a lot of discussions about, now, what are you studying and why? And I had also tied in a piece about psychological disorder symptoms. And I have to say that was generally more interesting to people in Namibia. They were supportive of this personality study, but I think it speaks to some of the things we talked about earlier, where our traits and these views of oneself is it is something that's maybe more relevant and more interesting in an individualistic context. Also in a context where we have a really big diversity of role options. And so we're thinking a lot about exactly what kind of career we want. And yeah, just the individualism. We have, just a lot of choices about how we self-present and what hobbies we pursue. And so again, I didn't experience people saying negative things about the personality study, but when I would start talking about, okay, and then we're going to look at psychological disorder symptoms, I would get much more people saying, this is really important. We have a really high suicide rate in Namibia. We don't have enough, psychological services. I did some interviews with people about depression and trauma, and all over the country, people were saying, thank you for talking about these things. We need to be talking more about these things. So as far as where to start, I think you can end up, letting yourself be influenced a little bit. I think like Samaya's talking about too, by the local context, and maybe maybe in collaborating, being open to, adding variables. So maybe you have something that really makes sense to do from the perspective of your, research heritage, but making space, being open to add some other variables that people consider interesting locally can take you in really interesting directions.
I think that's an awesome comment, Amber, and also Sumaya, about like just building in community participation. I think to build off of that, something that I'd really like to see in some of the papers that eventually get published are more qualitative insights and things where it's like, hey, I was, hanging out with this one person, we were talking about this issue and it was very important. And I think that us personality psychologists are probably some of the biggest stat dorks around. But some of the most enjoyable parts of papers that I've read have been things like, Amber, when you were talking with people, Khoikhoi speakers, and they were talking about personality traits in a qualitative fashion. And the sample of that was like 17 people, but getting the actual quotes and putting that, in the results and discussion section really helped me as a person who's never been there in my life to get a little bit of a handle beyond, here's the mean, here's the standard deviation, et cetera. About these variables, getting a more qualitative background, I think can really help intercultural transmission in the form of published papers.
Well, thank you for saying that. Rebecca.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much. The symposium was really interesting and I love the discussion. I was wondering about something that also Bill wrote in the chat a little bit about. So I'm wondering how much research is done that goes beyond individualistic and collectivistic values, and how much we know about like value structure and value hierarchies in countries, and how that informs what traits and characteristics are. I mean, we can go beyond Big Five, are most salient and rewarded in that country, because I think it could also inform like immigration studies and why people struggle to immigrate in certain countries more than they immigrate in others. So this is just an example, and sorry to all the Swiss people listening, but so I know a couple of people who like moved from Italy and Spain to Switzerland, and they don't like it because we're like boring people. We don't go out after dinner, we're like, we eat at 6, yada, yada, yada. And then they come and they're used to, being out until 10 p.m. and being with families and friends. And they struggle a lot, but maybe they wouldn't struggle depending on which country they went to, but also this research could acknowledge like why they struggle and how we can help and stuff like that. And so I was just wondering, I think they're country dependent values that kind of help us understand more like what happens with immigration problems that people might experience.
Yeah, it's a super interesting question, and I'm going to open the floor because someone else might have better answers than me. A couple of things that come to mind when you were asking that. I think there are, and I can't remember the author. I know in Heine's cultural psychology textbook, he describes some studies, because of course all these cultural values and personality variables are varying a lot within every context, as well as between personality, maybe less between contexts, but cultural values also between contexts as well as within. And I remember there as being a study that he cited in that textbook about people who move somewhere that's a good fit for them. So of course, in Italy and Spain, there are some more introverted people who are like, oh, everybody wants to go out so late. Finally, I moved to Switzerland where you're not expected to do that. So sometimes people move somewhere that's a good, for their particular personality, a good fit, and then acculturation, the studies show that acculturation goes better there. But yeah, maybe other people might have good answers to this. I also think the question of cultural values and what are the variables that best distinguish between countries is probably not personality traits. That's, you know, those kind of temperamental things are probably mostly varying within countries, but there are things that vary more between countries. I think it's an incredibly interesting question. I'm actually in the planning process for a study where we want to look at this. Gerard Saucier, I worked with him a bit on a study a few years ago where this was the goal. And there were about 300 different items. I think it was about 50 different inventories that were administered in 30 countries. And one of the most interesting things about that was that individualism and collectivism were really just in the middle as far as distinguishing between countries. And what was really at the top, that the variables that best distinguish between countries were the items of the Duke Religion Index. So people's engagement and activity as far as engaging in religion, and then some other items that had to do with family values and gender roles, your sort of worldviews, your beliefs around those things. So I guess that's sort of including with values, worldviews, beliefs, and some behaviors. But to me, it's a super interesting question. What are, you know, the constructs that best distinguish between nations? And I do think that individualism, collectivism, definitely the one we know best. But I think lots of cultural psychologists agree it's really overused. It's kind of a blunt instrument. It is meaningful. It does say something, but it doesn't seem to be the variable that says the most in what we really want to know when we're talking about these cultural differences. Anyone else want to answer or comment this question? Maybe we'll come back to that. And Chris Martin.
Yeah, this is just in response to Bill's comment about well-being across cultures. There's one researcher named Mohsen Joshanlu, who's originally from Iran, and then he did some of his work in South Korea, and then some in New Zealand. And he has a couple of really interesting papers. One is on contrast between Western and Islamic conceptions of well-being, and one is on contrast between Western and Eastern conceptions. And they're both based quite a bit on religion and religious differences. And it's not entirely doing us justice, but roughly there's more interest in eudaimonia in Eastern religions, or more emphasis on eudaimonia, on harmony rather than autonomy, and so on. But they're really good papers.
Will you say the name of the author?
Yeah, his last name is Joshanlu. I'll type it in the chat as well. It's okay. Joshanloo.
Okay, great. Thanks for sharing that. That's
sure.
Useful for me too. John, do you have a comment for us?
I do. First, just thanks for this really stellar symposium. It really seems sort of paradigm shifting in a way that's really powerful. So thank you for that. My comment was about thinking about the ways in which a personality psychology worldview in particular might give us some real pros, but also some real cons in translating that to thinking about culture. and thinking about the ways in which personality psychologists tend to construe the world and whether that is the right lens for them thinking about culture. So for example, we tend to, just in the informal comments that people have made today, we tend to think about personality as static. Of course, we know about personality change, but monolithic, and those kinds of things. Whereas culture, if we think about culture in those terms, we may actually fundamentally misconstrue culture. And I wonder if personality development is a lens that might be both familiar to many of us, but also useful for thinking about culture. That offers an opportunity to think about culture as varying over time, not experienced equally by all members of a culture. And I know that cultural psychology, which is different than cross-cultural psychology, is a pretty sophisticated lens for understanding sort of the dynamic person-culture interaction. So I just wanted to put that out there for us to be reflective about the ways in which our own outlook is shaped by being a personality psychologist, and to really question whether that's the most appropriate lens for thinking about culture.
Yeah, excellent point. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that actually a little bit in terms of if personality structure is our dependent variable and culture is our independent variable, and cultures change, then how might personality structures change, or the salience of various personality items change as a culture, develops, or as globalization kind of creates more and more homogeneity across cultures, that perhaps personality structure will start to look a little bit more similar as dominant modes of capitalism kind of shape more local cultures. And yeah, so
that's
I think
interesting, Ted. I would just add that even within, if we think about American culture or North American culture, right, culture is not experienced equally by all members of that culture. And those, right. If there is if we are exporting that sort of dominant cultural, then we're probably also exporting the ways in which people experience that dominant culture differently. And so we want to think about those experiences too.
Yeah, agreed.
I should probably just think about this more, but as you were speaking, I couldn't help actually seeing sort of a parallel, we like to think of personality as, we like to focus on its stable aspects because we want something to stay still so that we can study it, when in fact it's a very dynamic world where everything's moving around constantly and the atoms are spinning. But we want something to stay still. And in a way, I don't know, I would almost think of the cultural context, this environment is maybe almost similarly stable and similarly dynamic as an individual's personality. There's a lot of stability, and there's also change, and certain things, of course, certain life experiences, the world changing around you can lead your personality to maybe change more than it might otherwise. And similarly with a cultural context, things might be more or less dynamic, or in a certain time. So it actually seems like maybe you could also make the case that personality psychologists might be well suited to study culture, cultural characteristics, but it is so important, agreed, to be reflexive about, what lens you're bringing to these things. So maybe I'll, it's like a slight pause. I can't remember how much time we have. Do we have until the end of the hour, or no? How much more time do we have? Like 5 more minutes or something? Okay. So there were a couple other questions that I threw out, and maybe I'm just going to throw a couple of them out at once. One was about ideas for how to retain international members. So ARP is doing this drive to increase membership. I've forwarded that opportunity to at least a dozen people in different countries. But what I would love to be hearing from any of them, and from anyone here who can speak to that, is what are the things that ARP can do to retain those members, and to make this a society that is really interesting and useful to people from different countries. If anyone has any thoughts about that, I would love to hear them. Yeah, Bill, will you give us a comment?
Well, one thing we can do is make sure we don't schedule our conferences that conflict with other international conferences. As some of you know on the board of ARP know, I got really irritated when we originally scheduled ARP in Evanston to conflict with a meeting, 2 international meetings in Europe that were back to back in the week in between ARP. We need to be a little more sensitive to the other conferences around the world, rather than saying we will schedule an ARP time, European conference schedules it on German time because the Germans go on vacation in August. We just need to be very sensitive to when we're scheduling our conferences. That sounds trivial.
Yeah, but it's actually
to it.
Yeah, it's actually a good point. And if you think about really wanting to become more international, then you think about there's different religious holidays, there's different really meaningful national things as well as other conferences. And so it's actually on a practical level, it's a good point. And it might be that for whoever's planning the conference might want to do something along the lines of a doodle poll or something, like just pull different to try to find out what we might be setting that in the middle of.
Because I'm particularly sensitive to this International Society for the Study of Individual Differences, which does look at cross-cultural work. For last year's schedule, everything's off now, of course, was going to be exactly conflicting with ARP. This is crazy. And just we need to be sensitive to this.
Yeah, and the more international and that the society becomes, the harder this will be. But right. Yeah, something to address. Yeah, Jessie, go ahead.
Hi, so I am based in North America, but I have like Australian colleagues, and they from what I've heard from them, it sounds like they have the impression that ARP is a very North American focused society because its conference is always in North America, and it seems like it would be difficult to make us seem more international if that's always the case. And if there are already 2 other professional organizations, so there's ISID and the World Conference on Personality, that were designed to be more international, like from the beginning, and have their conferences in international locations. So even one thing I was wondering is, even if if it's possible to have like some kind of ARP conference in a different country, or if not that, then to create like smaller networking opportunities in different countries for local members to be able to gather.
Yeah, I'm serving on the international committee for SPSP right now, and this is a constant. This is just a real struggle we're having. SPSP being, of course, a much bigger organization than ARP, and being the dominant organization for those topics internationally, and yet being an American organization, but having an international committee, these things are really challenging. And maybe for a society that's that big, hard to address. And ARP being smaller actually potentially has the option. ARP could decide to reimagine themselves. I don't know, I'm not serving on the board or anything, so I don't know how these things get talked about, but it seems like there is some potential that ARP could decide to identify as an international organization, and that would mean various changes, but it's small and maybe agile enough that that could be a possibility and could be really cool because they're, anyway, it's a thought. Kevin. You go ahead.
I want to chime in on the conference theme and the international nature of ARP. It may be that conferences, the traditional in-person conferences, have all of these wonderful functions, including social functions and networking functions, but they're also carbon intensive, they're exclusive, they're expensive, and obviously they're geographically bounded. And it could be that, I don't know what people think, but if I did know what people think, I'd be a much better psychologist. But I wonder how well this conference, with its staggered times and everything, is working, and whether, a nimble, small, staggered conference like this is part of the answer to increasing the accessibility of ARP. My guess is that this is not perfect, although I've enjoyed the talks as well a lot. And I enjoyed the dialogue today, especially. It really brought some of these issues to life. You know, I think that departing from the traditional model has a lot to be said for it. And we won't be doing traditional conferences in 10 or 20 years, or not in the same way.
Yeah, such an interesting point. I guess we only have 1 or 2 more minutes. Mushen Tsi, I hope I'm not totally.
Yeah, I can quickly done this. I'm actually an international student from China, so I kind of know. I'm my whole career developed in the US. Excuse me, but sorry, I'm so sorry about that. But then my culturally background is from China, and I more or less know about like the psychological science development in China right now. It's not really good, and we don't like. I mean, for personality psychology, we don't have enough faculties and people are in this field in China at all. So that might be a thing before we talking about how could we get more members globally. I don't know about other countries, but China, we are facing that problem. So like I think Jesse just said, we can potentially have a local group or maybe like a local network channels that we can like let Dr. Fang and people like in this local professionals can actually have their power to connect with other researchers and build up a subpopulation in certain communities or cultures. After that, I guess it might be more easier for us to help like make our current conference or current association more globally, I guess.
Great, thanks for sharing those ideas. Okay, I think that we are supposed to wrap up because there's other, I've been so absorbed on this, I haven't totally looked at the schedule, but I know there's other things coming. Joanne, does someone want to talk about the upcoming schedule? What else is coming up?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for this interesting discussion. We're going to save the chat, and thanks again to all the speakers that were able to make it today. We're going to be headed into a data blitz, and then after that, I think there's a poster session. You can check out the links at the, we sent out an email. If you haven't seen it, just send me an email and I can send you the links that are for today. But we hope to see you later today at all of the events, and especially at the social hour where we'll be having a speed meet event. Take care, everybody, and thanks again.
Thank you so much, everyone, for all the ways you participated and spoke up. Really appreciated. And I myself, I think the other speakers will be at the Gather Town social event and really love to hear more from you all then.
See you there.